In the forever winter, Europa is not merely a political faction. It is the remnant of an ambitious vision, a decaying testament to what was once imagined as a global order of prosperity and stability. To understand Europa, one must begin with its origins, which stretch back to the early 21st century, when the pressures of globalization, resource scarcity, and mounting political crises forced nations into an uneasy union. The Federation of Europa was conceived as a great synthesis of Western Europe, North America, parts of South America, and fragments of Oceania, a superstate that bound together nations with long and fraught histories of rivalry, colonialization, and conflicting ideologies. On paper, this was to be the final safeguard against collapse, a centralized political and military power that would prevent fragmentation and defend its citizens against outside threats. Yet from the beginning, Europa's foundations were poisoned with coercion, suspicion, and resentment. For many states, particularly in South America and the periphery of Europe, joining Europa was less a matter of choice and more a necessity, imposed through economic sanctions, political manipulation, or outright intimidation. Anti-European sentiment erupted in the streets even in its early years, as citizens recognized that beneath the rhetoric of unity, their nations had become subordinate to a greater machine. Some governments embraced the Federation willingly, seeing in it a chance to ride the coattails of wealthier Western powers, while others dragged along their sovereignty hollowed in exchange for vague promises of security. In this way, Europa was never the harmonious collective it claimed to be. It was a patchwork empire, fragile yet colossal, an amalgamation held together by bureaucracy, force, and propaganda. Still, in those early decades, there was hope. With access to enormous economic and industrial resources, Europa appeared capable of managing the crisis of famine, climate instability, and dwindling natural reserves. Trade flourished across the Atlantic. Technological initiatives were announced to solve energy shortages, and propaganda heralded a new age of peace. But the cracks were already visible. Beneath the surface, inequalities between member regions widened, and entire populations began to feel abandoned by distant authorities of the Federation. Industrial centers in North America and Western Europe prospered, but smaller states languished under debt and exploitation, their resources funneled into the great European machine. The descent into authoritarianism followed as predictably as the setting of the sun. Civil unrest grew as populations demanded fair treatment, and rather than yield, Europa responded with surveillance, militarized policing, and stifling of dissent. The megacity of Los Angeles became the most infamous symbol of this control, a city where cameras lined every street, checkpoints forced citizens to prove loyalty at every corner, and thought crime scanners monitored even the hidden recesses of one's mind. It was here that the Provisional Police and its elite Special Provisional Branch perfected the tactics of totalitarian order, combining brute force with advanced technologies of suppression. Citizens continued to work, trade, and live, but always under the shadow of watchtowers and armoured patrols. Everyday life was permitted, but never free, and so the dream of unity decayed into the machinery of control, setting the stage for Europa's role in the catastrophic war that would consume the world and freeze history in the forever winter. The fall of Europa from an uneasy federation into a wartime superstate was not sudden, but the escalation that triggered the forever winter happened with a brutality that shocked even its own people. For decades, tension had simmered with Eurasia, the rival superpower that stretched across the eastern continent, where Europa relied on mass industry and mechanical production, Eurasia pursued biotechnological mastery and agricultural engineering, developing genetically modified crops and hybridized soldier systems that seemed almost alien to European observers. The rivalry between these two titans was inevitable, for their spheres of influence overlapped. Their ambitions clashed, and the resources of the planet were dwindling to levels that could no longer support both. No single event can be identified as the moment the Great War began. Some historians within the shattered archives of Europe whisper of secret skirmishes in Central Asia, where the two blocs tested one another's strength. Others suggest that a chain of resource embargoes and retaliatory strikes spiraled out of control, until conventional politics gave way to nuclear aggression. But what is for certain is that when the conflict truly ignited, it was apocalyptic in scale. Nuclear exchanges leveled command centers and strategic targets across both powers. Eurasia lost its highest military coordination and much of its orbital satellite infrastructure, while Europa's leadership was annihilated in the opening hours of the war, leaving its chain of command fragmented and chaotic. The consequences were dire. Deprived of clear leadership, Europa staggered into the conflict like a headless giant, stumbling yet still able to crush everything in its path by sheer momentum. Its vast industrial reserves kept its armies moving, but strategy faltered and communication collapsed. Soldiers on the front were often left without orders, fighting battles that no longer had meaning, bleeding out men and resources for objectives that no longer existed. Yet, because Eurasia had suffered equally devastating blows, neither side was capable of pressing the advantage to achieve a final victory. The stalemate metastasized into a condition of permanence, and the war became endless, not because either side wanted it, but because neither side could survive without continuing it. Europa invaded Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, seizing territory held by Eurasia's ally, Eurasia, while at the same time fighting invasions into the Americas. Cities burned, infrastructure crumbled, and famine swept through populations that once dreamed of stability. The Federation's propaganda machines insisted that the war was being won, or at least not lost, but citizens quickly realized that the conflict had no resolution. The world had been broken, and in its shattered state, Europa's power was locked into eternal motion. The environment itself rebelled against humanity's excess. Nuclear firestorms poisoned the skies and soils. Plagues followed in the wake of ruined sanitation, and industrial contamination rendered wide regions barren. What was left of agriculture collapsed, forcing entire nations into hunger and desperation. Disease spread through armies and cities alike, mutating in the toxic conditions left by chemical and nuclear weapons. In such environments, civil unrest intensified, but Europa's response was unflinching. More surveillance, more militarization, and more repression. By the time the dust of the initial exchange settled, the shape of the world was unrecognizable. The forever winter had begun, not simply as a metaphor for ceaseless war, but as the literal condition of the Earth's ecosystem. Darkened skies, ruined crops, and poisoned landscapes created an endless season of scarcity, twilight of civilization that no nation could escape. Europa, once heralded as the beacon of Western unity, was now only a war machine, feeding itself on its own people, and lashing out across continents, not for conquest, but for survival. Its citizens lived without the knowledge that there was no end, no peace treaty, no return to normal life. There was only the war, eternal and absolute. If Europa can be said to have survived its catastrophic loss of leadership during the opening stages of the Forever Winter, it did so not through vision or ideology, but through the relentless inertia of its military machine. Unlike Eurasia, which leaned heavily into radical experimentation and grotesque bioengineering, Europa relied on the sheer bulk of its industrial capacity, producing tanks, aircraft, and soldiers in staggering numbers. It was a war machine built less on innovation than on replication, a tide of steel and flesh that could crash endlessly against enemy lines. What it lacked in elegance or strategic brilliance, it compensated for with redundancy and overwhelming mass. The infantry remained the bedrock of European combat, and despite their shortcomings, these soldiers embodied the grim persistence of the Federation. The common European soldier, clad in practical, if outdated, equipment, was ubiquitous on every battlefield. They were not elites, nor were they the genetically and mechanically augmented terrors of their rivals. Instead, they were ordinary conscripts, pressed into service by a state that had little else to offer them. Many were the youths, taken under the so-called Minor Age Adjustment Enlistment Act, which lowered conscription ages to fill gaps left by horrific casualty rates. For these young fighters, the war offered not glory, but escape from the even harsher miseries of civilian life, starvation, disease, and the suffocating weight of Europa's surveillance state. Within their ranks were squad leaders such as the Grin, equipped with heavier weapons and tasked with maintaining order in combat. These figures were terrifying in close quarters, wielding shotguns and rifles with brutal efficiency. But even they were expendable in the greater scheme of the war. Behind them marched the EOD units, walking fortresses clad in armour and wielding devastating firepower. Where ordinary infantry fell in droves, the EOD advanced like juggernauts, breaking through entrenched positions at terrible cost to their opponents. Their rarity in the field did little to diminish their impact, and stories circulated among survivors of how 3 EODs could hold off entire companies through sheer firepower. More elite still were the Terminators, grim figures in blue armour armed with grenade launchers. These were not mere soldiers, but symbols of Europa's willingness to breed terror into its war machine. Yet, infantry was only part of the greater picture. Europa's true strength lay in its mechs and armoured vehicles, monuments of industry that towered over the battlefield. The medium mech, a hulking bipedal machine bristling with rifles, miniguns, and quad guns, exemplified this philosophy. It was slow, noisy, and often inefficient, but it was terrifying to behold. Its 360-degree arsenal allowing it to cut down attackers from every angle. Destroying one required teamwork and immense firepower, and the destructions of such a machine carried strategic consequences, for it represented not only material loss, but also damage to the fragile reputation Europa clung to. Beyond these, European forces fielded exosuits for agility, titans for overwhelming presence, and specialized walkers like the Stilt units, each representing a piece of a doctrine that relied on mass and spectacle. When Europa moved its forces, it did so like a continent shifting, crushing everything beneath its weight. Regardless of the inefficiencies of its methods, to fight Europa was not to confront brilliance or precision, but to endure an onslaught that seemed inexhaustible. Powered by the fading heartbeat of an empire that refuses to admit its own death. If Europa's armies are the outward projection of its power, then its society reveals the cost of sustaining that projection. The Federation's civilian population lives in conditions that reflect the paradox of a nation that must appear strong while rotting from within. On the surface, cities continue to function. Factories churn out weapons, markets trade in scarce goods, and offices hum with bureaucratic activity. Yet beneath this thin veneer lies a reality of poverty, disease, famine, and an omnipresent sense of dread. For most citizens, life has been reduced to survival under the twin weights of scarcity and repression. The authoritarianism that had taken root even before the war metastasized shows in cities like Lost Angels, where surveillance is not simply a precaution, but a way of life. Cameras line every street, drones hover above neighborhoods, and thought crime scanners have made even private dissent dangerous. Citizens learn quickly that even their inner lives are subject to scrutiny of the state. At checkpoints, military police interrogate travelers, rifles ready, and the provisional police, backed by their feared special provisional branch, serve as both enforcers and executioners. These agents are tasked not merely with maintaining order, but with extinguishing even the possibility of rebellion. Their power is absolute, and the line between civilian policing and military occupation has all but vanished. Daily life is therefore lived under a form of suspended animation, where people go to work, maintain households, and cling to the rituals of normalcy, but always with the knowledge that they are being watched. The war effort permeates every corner of existence. Children are taught loyalty to Europa in schools. Propaganda posters remind the population of their duty, and rationing dictates the rhythms of everyday meals. What little leisure time exists is often spent in propaganda theatres, or state-provided entertainments that reinforce the illusion that Europa is holding steady. Yet, beneath this facade, citizens whisper to one another about shortages, about family members lost at the front, about neighbours disappearing in the night for daring to question the regime. The militarization of civil society is total. Conscription is not a threat, but a certainty, and families live in the knowledge that their sons and daughters will be taken, whether they wish it or not. The Minor Age Adjustment Enlistment Act, infamous for its conscription of children, is defended by the state as a patriotic necessity. Many of these young recruits do not survive their first battles, but for the desperate poor, military service is often preferable to starving at home. For some, the battlefield at least offers food, shelter, and a grim sense of purpose. Propaganda plays a crucial role in maintaining this fragile system. The state's communications insist that the war is not lost, that victory is still possible, and that sacrifices are noble contributions to the greater cause. In reality, citizens know the truth, that there will be no end, that the war is not winnable in any conventional sense. Still, the illusion must be maintained, for without it, despair would overwhelm what little loyalty remains. For Europa, survival depends on belief as much as it does on any weapon, and so its leaders feed the people stories of stability while tightening the chains of control. Europa's existence cannot be fully understood without considering the rival superpowers that share the world. Its nemesis, Eurasia, represents the mirror opposite of Europa's philosophy. Where Europa relies on industrial replication and brute strength, Eurasia embraces biotechnology, genetic manipulation, and a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine. Eurasia's soldiers are engineered for precision and adaptability, their crops modified to survive environmental collapse, their armies capable of striking with devastating speed and intelligence. Against such an opponent, Europa's forces may appear clumsy even archaic, yet they are formidable in their sheer numbers and capacity for destruction. The contrast between the two factions underscore a central theme of the Forever Winter: the struggle between quantity and quality, between mechanical perseverance and biological ingenuity. Another rival, Eurasia, adds a layer of existential horror to this conflict. It forces the blur between life and machinery, merging sinew with steel, in forms that terrify European soldiers. Europa's armies, by contrast, are composed of humans and machines, kept distinct, kept different, a deliberate choice that reflects the Federation's adherence to older paradigms of warfare. The presence of Eurasia on the battlefield highlights not only Europa's technological conservationism, but also its commitment to industrial order as a moral principle. For Europa, to blend flesh and machine is an abomination. For Eurasia, it is a tool for survival. This philosophical divergence reinforces the perception of Europe as a civilization trapped in the traditions of its past, clinging to order even as the world descends into chaos. Europa's interactions with its rivals extend beyond combat. Political maneuvering and propaganda campaigns maintain a fragile balance of fear and hostility. Soldiers are indoctrinated to see enemies not merely as obstacles, but as existential threats to civilizations itself. Reports of battlefield atrocities, deliberate exaggerations of enemy power, and stories of heroic resistance circulate among the population, reinforcing the state's narrative that survival requires total obedience. Within this context, every mission, every offensive, every defensive line is imbued with significance, not only in tactical terms, but also in psychological warfare. Europa's survival depends as much on perception as it does on physical might. It is a war fought simultaneously on battlefields and in the minds of its citizens. Symbolically, Europa embodies the decline of industrial civilizations. Its cities are monuments to past ambition, their skyscrapers and factories crumbling even as they continue to function. Its armies are immense, powerful and mechanized, yet they are often inefficient, cumbersome, and prone to collapse without constant reinforcement. Europa's decay is both literal and metaphorical. Poisoned lands, famine, and disease reflect the environmental consequences of industrial overreach, while the repression of the citizens and the mechanization of daily life demonstrate social consequences of authoritarian governance. In Europa, the weight of the past is inescapable. Its citizens and soldiers are trapped in a world constructed by ancestors who promised unity, prosperity, and progress, yet delivered only war, surveillance, and decay. Europa, as a faction in the Forever Winter, leaves a complex legacy, both in its narrative role and its gameplay mechanics. Its armies, cities, and bureaucracies are not merely obstacles or settings, they are manifestations of a world in decline, a civilization that has survived its own excesses at enormous human cost. The legacy of Europa is therefore twofold. It is simultaneously a testament to human perseverance and a warning of dangers inherent in industrial overreach, authoritarianism, and the loss of moral compass in times of crisis. Every soldier that marches under the European banner, every mech that tramples across frozen landscapes, and every propaganda poster in its ruined cities speak to this duality. The gameplay interactions with Europa reinforce this. Players encounter the faction in many contexts, from small skirmishes against squads of infantry to large-scale confrontations with mechanized units and titans. Quests offered by Luca, the faction's primary intermediary, reveal not only strategic objectives, but also the human costs of the war. Players are forced to navigate the morally ambiguous landscape of a superstate at war, where killing an enemy soldier reduces reputation, yet failing to act may jeopardize survival or mission success. Players learn that brute strength can be countered with strategy, flexibility, and precision. As you are merely a scav in the world of the Forever Winter, you learn to avoid the European patrols, staying clear of their mechs and out of range of their drones. Though there are always so many soldiers on the battlefield, you have to pick your battles wisely, whether you engage against Europa or join with them on missions. You must choose where you go in this world. For remember, in the Forever Winter, the decisions are up to you. You fight with who helps you live the longest. Whether you agree with them or not, whether you can side with them or not, is up to you and the water you have in your storage. And Europa is a civilization that has survived catastrophe at the cost of freedom, prosperity, and moral clarity. Though it endures in its cycle of propaganda and decay, the ashes of the old world refuse to die out. The fire is still lit in the hollow cities and the raging battlefields. Even as the origins of the war fade from memory, Europa remains relentless and unmoving, a giant of the old world, a decayed wreck of what it once was, fighting for the scraps among the ruins of the Forever Winter.